Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you, Tomas, for this invitation. It's an honor to be both with President Figueres and with Luigi Einaudi, friends I've known for many years, and also with Mariano from Lima. I was asked to address the question of Kissinger in Latin America. And this is a topic I don't want to address, I think for good reason. I will try to explain in a couple of minutes why I don't want to address this topic, and then try to share with you a few thoughts on the Kissinger I would like to talk about. Why don't I want to talk about Kissinger in Latin America? Well, for a very simple reason. Inevitably, this is how history is written and told. Some events characterize a person or a country or a regime's performance at a given time in a given place. And Henry Kissinger in Latin America, unfortunately, will be recalled, I think, is recalled, and will be continued to be recalled for the policies that he advocated and implemented between September of 1970 and September of 1973 regarding Chile and the Allende regime. It's inevitable if you talk about Kissinger and Latin America to talk about Kissinger and Allende, Kissinger and Chile, Kissinger and the coup of 1973 that overthrew Allende. We can argue endlessly, and many scholars have, and they have enlightened us about all of these matters, about whether the coup came about because of Allende's incompetence, economic incompetence mainly, and the radicalization of people in the street, and the opposition or resistance of the Christian Democrats and the Chilean private sector, or whether it came about instigated by Nixon and Kissinger and the intelligence establishment, or either by actively promoting it or just winking and looking the other way. But this is such a sad episode in Latin American history and in US Latin American relations, and has done so much harm to the American image in Latin America and Kissinger's image in Latin America, that if one dwells upon it, I think one is unable to really consider Kissinger's other enormous accomplishments in many other fields. There is obviously Kissinger, the statesman, regarding Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union. The Vietnam chapter is a very complicated one. I'm sure Ambassador Einaudi will share his thoughts with us about it. Because yes, eventually peace came to Vietnam, but at a very high cost. And one can always argue whether that cost was so high because Kissinger made it so high for domestic political reasons, or whether it would have been higher had it not been him who was negotiating in Paris with Les Houphouët. In the case of the Soviet Union, one can always argue that the type of détente that he achieved with Brezhnev and with Gromyko did not last as long as it might have, because there was a lack of substance to it and a lack of capacity to implement. What obviously was a lasting achievement of Kissinger in government was the rapprochement between China and the United States. This was a historic event that has lasted until today, with all of the discussions and debates today about whether this is over or not over, whether there is now a new Cold War between China and the United States, whether China will invade Taiwan, etc. All of this discussion today, and it's an important discussion, a worthwhile one, goes back to the Shanghai Communique and goes back to the opening to China and goes back to Kissinger at least implementing it. And I would rather think that, as any good team of a president and his foreign policy executor, there was a give and take, a back and forth. It's impossible to say who started the ball rolling, because as much as Kissinger might have conceived all of this in his mind, without Nixon as president to go through with it, it would never have happened. And perhaps Nixon, with another advisor or thinker alongside him, would not have had the boldness to go ahead and do what he did with China. But these are just 8 years of Kissinger's career. His service in government ended in early 1977. In fact, nearly half a century has gone by since then. It's hard to appreciate how much he has written, how much he has said, how much he has thought, what contacts he has made since then. And in many ways, I would like to think of him more as someone, as the Kissinger after power, after office, rather than the Kissinger of those 8 years in office. He has given us, of course, the White House memoirs, and then as Secretary of State, but many other scholarly works on diplomacy, as one is called, on China, which is a brilliant book written by a non-China specialist on China. Non-China specialist, of course, because he didn't speak Chinese, and because he is not a China scholar in the strict sense of the word, but he probably knows more about China, or has known more Chinese leaders and thinkers and practitioners than anyone else outside of China over the past 50 years. I think he has given us an enormous amount of reflection on all of these matters. And most recently, and I will just devote my last couple of minutes to this, this very interesting, fascinating, I would say, interview that he had with the Economist editorial board just this past Sunday on all sorts of issues, but in particular on Ukraine and on the rivalry between China and the United States, and how worried he is that things could come apart between China and the United States, as each country perceives the other to be a real danger to it. And as he also sees Ukraine being a conflict which, of course, violates international law, violates the UN Charter. Yes, all of that is true, but at the same time, a conflict that has to be contained in order for it not to go beyond the bloody and tragic and terrible dimensions it already has achieved, but that could be much worse. If anyone wants to be familiar with Kissinger's thinking at its very best, I would say, I would strongly recommend this long interview in The Economist just this past weekend, which I think tells us a great deal about the world and about the United States. In a previous essay he published in The Economist, I think last year, in a series of pieces about the United States' role in the world, I was also invited to participate in that series. He made the point, as many of us also did, that perhaps one of the risks for the United States in its diplomacy and its role in the world lay domestically, more in what is happening, was happening, and will happen inside the United States than not only in its international projection. And I think this also tells us a lot about the quality, the scope of Kissinger's reflections on all of these matters. He has always written many insightful, intelligent, sometimes cynical things about the United States, but some of them are extraordinarily interesting, partly perhaps because he has always maintained a certain distance with his country of adoption. Thank you, Beatriz, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for having me here with such distinguished colleagues.